everyone, and welcome back to the studio for Flower Farm Week. It is July. We're working on our month 7 of Flower Farm, and we're actually on block 7 and block 8, which I'm really excited about. We had to take a little hiatus. We had some manufacturing issues here with our templates. Plus, it was a holiday, and we wanted to celebrate with family the 250th birthday of our nation. So we did that as a family as well. So we're back to the studio to filming. Another thing you may notice, I'll let you know ahead of time, is that 2 weeks ago I was filming. I was doing lives with Mancuso and teaching at their summer schoolhouse, which I loved. It was great. And we realized right before we went live that, or the week before we went live, that some of my cameras I film upside down, and then I change them and flip them in post-production. You don't know that, but I know that. So in order to do live, we had to swap some cameras around and do some things a little bit different. We had a new sewing machine here. So we moved the studio all around. We got new lights and new camera equipment. You'll see probably a few shadows we're still working out because I'm not a lighting engineer or a sound engineer, as you've known if you follow the channel at all. So you may notice some changes to the way the cameras are positioned or what the sewing machine looks like or all that. So that's just some housekeeping behind the scenes, as they are new. So we are doing things different. But the good news is that it makes it so much easier if I decide to do live on YouTube, which I've been wanting to do for a while. So we are all set up to go live now. It's so great. Today's video, though, is all about Flower Farm, and we're on block number 7, which is our Orchids block, and block number 8, which I believe is our Snapdragons block. You'll see the samples behind me of what we made this week, and we're going to make, we have to make 2 blocks each, so we've already made 1. We're going to make the other 2 together, so that'll be kind of great. So remember, when you're watching me and I'm pulling out fabrics to do things, I'm doing it for 1 block, you're going to do it for 2. So I'll try to make sure that I reference how many of those you need to make so you're not confused. So if you're ready to get started, I also wanted to tell you that I know I mentioned last week that these blocks are getting a little bit more intense. They're still 16-inch blocks, but they have a lot of parts, and that you wanted to check your 1/4-inch seam really well. And I set up a really quick demo to the best way to do that, to understand between stitching and pressing and all of that, what's the best way to find your 1/4-inch seam. So I'm going to do that as well. So if you're ready to get started on Flower Farm, you want to see the demo on that, you want to see a few other things that we have that are new, you got to stick around, and we're going to get started. Hey guys, I'm glad you stuck around. Let's get started on our blocks. So our first block today, block number 7, which is our Orchids block. Couple of things to tell you about that. So on Orchids block, we start with a very hard navy in the center as our first fabric. Oh, by the way, you may notice that I'm calling out the fabrics each month. I'm not calling them the fabric number that's on the book. I'm actually calling them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as they're listed in each page. The reason I'm doing that is because, remember, from the very beginning of the videos, I'm using stash. So I started with fat 1/4 bundle. I have pulled other fabrics yardage from stash so that I can mix and match these blocks. So each month I'm figuring out which fabrics I'm going to use for each one. And I'm calling them out based on the top fabric to the bottom fabric, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I did have a very interesting question from a viewer, which we will address today, because I think it's a great question. And I made a couple of changes, particularly to this block, in my fabric choices that I really wanted you to see. So if you remember in the beginning, I talked a lot about organization. And I just wanted to show you a little bit of why I did the block this way. We're going to get to that in a second. Let me show you my organization real quick on how this is shaping up as we make these blocks. All right, so you will remember in the beginning, I have this project box. By the way, any products that we show, we went ahead and set up an Amazon storefront. So rather than seeing all the individual links, you'll be able to go right to the page and find those things. Here's our project box. Remember, mine came with all these little sheets, these little plastic sheets that hold everything. So in the bottom here, I have my fat quarters divided up. There's my reds and my navy blues. On this sheet, I have my lighter blues here, and also the creams and the cream prints right there. This next sheet just has some yardage. This started out as, you know, half yard or a yard or whatever, and this is what's left of it. So it's a little bit too small. It's probably about a quarter yard or a little bit better. It's too small to go in my bookshelf on with all the other yardage. Same with this one. This is a background. So they go in the next section, and then I have my little top sheet right here. Every time I open up a fat quarter and I use a fat quarter for part of the block, I actually take the leftover and I put it on this top sheet. Some of these pieces are maybe a fat eighth. Some are just a strip, but anything that's large enough that I might be able to get parts out, I go ahead and I put them right here in this box. And then if you look here, I have this other little zipper box. I actually have two of these. One of them's over at my sewing machine. This is where all of the little leftover strips are from. So if I need a couple of squares here and there, or in the case of, you'll see in a minute, I have a mistake and I need to cut something else out, I can do that from this little bin. And these little bins are great. They are hard-sided plastic soft cases. They zip up, and they're great to take your project to your next event or anything like that. And I have those and those listed in the Amazon storefront. So this is the organization part. And this top bin part especially is what I want to talk about next. So if you'll look at the Flower Farm book, you'll notice there are 5 fabrics. And the orchid block shows a navy print right here in the corner. I kept the navy print in the corner in the center as it was in the pattern. The next 2 fabrics, fabric 2 and 3, are 2 different greens. You know, this is a Flower Farm quilt, and it was designed to show flowers, not show patriotics. So I'm changing it up a little bit each time. And so I didn't want to use as many greens. I did use some greens in our smaller blocks, and I'm okay with having those leaflet and sprig type things in the quilt as a green. I'm perfectly fine with that, but I don't want to have too much green. So I swapped the 2 greens out for red and lighter blue. So you'll notice those are the changes that I made in the block. So if you look at block number 1 or fabric number 1 on your block, you'll see a navy. I have a navy. Fabric number 2 in your book is a green. I chose light blue. My fabric 3 is a red. My fabric 4 is just like in the book, is a creamed background floral, tiny print floral, which is what we have here. And then I have my background fabric. So I've changed it up a little bit. The second way I changed it up is because I was changing out those fabrics for the greens for the red and the light blue. I only needed to cut rectangles and squares out of these reds and blues. And I thought, you know what? I'll use up some of the parts that I have in the top of the bin. Well, there wasn't enough of one color to get all of the parts out, but what I did do was I cut all my rectangles out of one red and cut all my squares out of another red. Did the same thing with the light blue, all my rectangles out of one light blue, all my squares out of another light blue. So you'll see when we get up close to the actual fabrics that they are 2 different fabrics, but the color scheme is the same. So if that makes sense, and I just want to show you kind of how I've organized it. When you're making scrap quilts, this is kind of how it goes. You start out with fat quarter, you use part of it, you wind up with some scraps, and then you start getting towards the end or the middle, and you start mixing and matching some of those fabrics together. It's easier to do with the smaller blocks, but also can be a little bit confusing because when we start getting into smaller blocks, usually the number of blocks we're making goes up. So then you have to remember, okay, I cut these out of this out of this. It can be very confusing. So before we get a little bit too far into confusing, I thought, well, I'll throw in a little bit of scrappiness into this block a little bit so you can see how I do it. So, so that's the fabric for this one. And then the Snapdragon block, which is over here, block number 8, had 6 fabrics listed. Our first fabric that was listed, I believe, was a green, which is the outside fabric here for the corner squares. And I chose a lighter blue. The way that you can see in the book, the way the quilt was built, it's very pale. It has a red and a pink and a green and a yellow. And that doesn't fit our color scheme for this quilt. So you can do yours any way that you want. I chose to change mine up a little bit. So for that green fabric, I swapped out for light blue. Then I believe there was a yellow fabric in there. I made that my navy. I kept fabric number 3 as a red. That's my center. The next fabric listed in the book, I believe, is a pink. For pink, I chose this red. So I have more of this solid or mottled red here. And then there was a small cream floral, just like the first one. I chose this kind of graphic star print, and then a background, which is out here on the outside. So I mixed and matched. I've used 6 different fabrics in this block. In this block, we had 5 colors. I went ahead and threw some scraps in there. And obviously we've got all our parts cut out, so let's take a look at that, and then we'll move over to the sewing machine. All right, guys, this board right here, this is all the fabrics for, let me move that out of the way, for our orchid block. Fabric number 1 is here. Here's our change to fabric 2 and 3. This is fabric 2, and you can see my squares are 1 print and my rectangles are another print. Fabric 3, same thing, different prints, but same color. Fabric 4 is this small floral, and fabric 5 is the background. So, and you can see my little background has these gold swirls and stars in it. It turned out really nice. So I think this was a Christmas print. I repurposed it for this quilt because it had a little bit of a cream background. So that one works great. And then moving on to our Snapdragon block, I have my fabric number 1 here is my light blue. Fabric 2 is my dark blue. Here's my red for fabric 3. I also have a red for fabric 4. My little small scale floral version, or my interpretation of that, for fabric 5, and 6 is our background fabric. Now you'll notice I have this little piece up here. When I was making the block yesterday, I pulled this square out and realized I just have a tiny little hint of selvage, just a tiny little bit right there. I noticed the little parts, and so I pulled a piece out of that scrap bucket. This little guy right here, which has all my leftover strips, I pulled out this guy right here, which are 2 little long strips of fabric cut that size, and I pulled those out so that I could cut a replacement for this square, and then I can look through all these squares and make sure I don't have any more selvages hiding in there. So that's why these are out referenced this way. So without further ado, let's go over to the sewing machine. We'll get started on block number 7. And before we do that, last week I mentioned that these blocks have a few more parts, especially this one right here, 16 inches, but we have a lot more little bits and bobs and parts that are belonging to these types of blocks. So it becomes much more essential that we know we have the right 1/4 inch seam. So I've prepared a very quick, easy demo in order for you to figure out your 1/4 inch seam and make sure that it works. And it's probably the most practical one because it involves stitching and pressing, which is what we're going to be doing, not just measuring where the stitches are in your block. So let's go over to the sewing machine. We're going to look at that demo, and then we're going to start putting together block number 7. All right, so before we get started, let's look at this sort of demo that I have used for years in order to figure out whether or not we have the perfect 1/4 inch. So usually we have like this, you know, my diagonal seam tapes is aligned with my needle. I have a 1/4 inch line over here. I also have a 1/4 inch ruler right here. I can check the edge of the foot, make sure that my needle is where it's supposed to be. That's all very helpful. When I lay my needle or my ruler right at the edge of my foot, I see that my needle is just shy, or as they call in the quilting world, scant of the 1/4 inch line. And so it would seem as though I would want to move that needle to like 1 tick to the left in order for that to be my accurate 1/4 inch seam. And you'll hear quilters say a lot, oh, you got to use a scant 1/4, a scant 1/4. And what they mean by that is that once you stitch the piece together and then press it, you're going to lose a tiny little bit of space or measurement in there. It's just how that works. And then when you go to open it back up again, you know, maybe it's too wide or it's too narrow or whatever. So in order to test your 1/4 inch seam to make sure that it works, what I will do is I take 4 little pieces of fabric here, and I've done 3 that are the same color and 1 that's slightly different. And what you're going to do, these pieces should be exactly 1.5 inches wide by 3.5 inches long. So that's what these are, 1.5 by 3.5, okay? So 1.5 because we're going to have that 1/2 inch seam, and 3.5 because, you know, we want them all to be basically at a square right here. When we sew them together, we should have a square. And then I go one step further from that. So I'm going to move this guy out of the way, and what we'll do is sew these 2 or these 3 pieces together using our 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is what I've done with this piece right here. So I've done all 3 seams together. When you stitch this one to this one to this one, and then you press them apart, and it doesn't really matter which way you press them, I pressed my seams out away from the center. This will create a 3.5 inch square, which is great to test if you want to measure it on your ruler here, right here by my sewing machine. That's exactly what I have. But the real test comes when you lay the 3.5 inch piece on the top of that block and stitch it. It should match perfectly. So, and if it doesn't fit perfectly, there's something going on. Either your seam allowance is too big or too small, or maybe you have an error in your pressing, which can also be a problem. So you might be pressing too far out, or with steam and stretching your fabric, or not pressing enough and you have some foldovers, or whatever the case may be. So if you take those 4 strips, and they can be different colors or the same colors, doesn't really matter. I just took a piece of fabric that was by my sewing machine. Just layer them down so that they are perfectly matched, and then go ahead and stitch your 1/4 inch seam. All right, so I have gone ahead over to the iron, and I have pressed all 3 strips. And now I'm going to take my 3.5 inch wide strip and lay it corner to corner, point to point on the top of those strips. This is now this guy right here is a perfect 3.5 inch square, and I know its width because I can lay this down and it fits perfectly. So I can then stitch this to the top, and if I've done it correctly, it'll open up and look like a nice little piece that is perfect on both sides, and it fits perfectly, okay? So this is a practical way to test your 1/4 inch seam, because you're actually stitching, pressing, and trying to sew something that's measured to go together back onto your part. Step 1 of our piecing guide says you're going to take 4 pairs of C and L. So C is going to be this fabric right here. On my board, it's number 1, so it's my square, and your L fabrics, which are going to be the same size square in your background fabrics, and we're going to go ahead and stitch 1/4 inch on both sides of that seam allowance in order to be able to open them up and create half square triangles. So I'll draw a diagonal. I'm only doing 2. I'm doing 2, you're doing 4. So I'm just going to draw that diagonal line. And then when I go to cut, I'm actually going to use my Clearly Perfect slotted trimmer before I open them up, so they're trimmed to the right size. So, and then I know I can sew 1/4 inch on either side of that line, which is what I'm going to do right now, using my 1/4 inch foot that I have tested. There we go. All right, I'm going to get my tiny mat out, and I'm just going to cut these by putting my rotary cutter on the mat right down that center line, cuts them apart, and we're going to leave them like that for a second. If any of you are interested in the slotted trimmer, I have that on the Amazon storefront as well. All right, so it says in the instructions that we're going to trim these to 2.5. So if you haven't seen the slotted trimmer at work, while they're still folded, you have a seam line right there, and you're going to set your seam line right on the 2.5-inch seam line. And I'm probably going to have to move this around the camera, but I'll do it once so you can see it. And once that's down, you're just going to hold on to your part. I am going to trim this side, and also I can trim out my little triangle there. And then I can do the same thing on the other side. I'll have to turn my mat so I can get it. Always a problem when you do things on camera. All right, so now I have a perfectly sized square with the dog ears cut off. When I open it up, it's going to be exactly 2.5 inches. So it's much easier to trim it when it's folded, but hard to do with a regular ruler. So I'm going to go ahead and do that 3 more times. You will do it 8 times because you're making 2 blocks, and we'll come back and move on to the next step. All right, we are done. We have trimmed and pressed, and I've pressed my seams open, which I do for all half square triangles. And there we are. And so that is step 1. I'm just going to set those over here to the side. And then we're going to move on to step 2. And we're going to pay careful attention to the seam itself. So for this, we need our B pieces, which are going to be from our fabric 1. And then we need our background squares. Again, in this case, I need 4 of them. You're going to need 8. And you're going to pay attention to the angle that you need to sew these to. So we're going to take these squares and add them to our rectangle. And again, this is just going to be right through the center diagonal of the block. And what we're going to do is this is going to be the same each time. We're going to lay our square on top of our B rectangle on the left-hand side, and we're going to stitch from that corner down to the bottom corner. So right at the edge on the top, down to the bottom center, okay? I'm going to turn my block around because, as you know, I don't like to start at a point because it sometimes will eat the points. So I'm going to turn it around to start on the fabric edge, but the same thing applies. And I'm not going to draw this time. I'm just going to use that diagonal seam tape line. There it is, right there. And I'm just going to guide my machine to going right down that point, okay? So I'm going to lay this down, and I want to make sure, just like the book, that everything's going from the right angle. These all look great, okay? So the next step is to go ahead and press that open so that it looks like the part in the book. Once it's pressed, I'm going to go in behind and I'm going to trim out that excess in the back. All right, step 3 is assembling these corner units. Here's the beginning of the corner unit. So what we need are some of these background squares. I'm going to need 4. You're going to need 8. We're going to put them all together like that. So the first thing I have to do is take all my triangles and stitch them like so together with their little half square triangle guy. And that's what I'm going to do. Once all these guys are done, I clip their little threads. And then we're going to press them. And the book says you need to press the seam. In this case, I'm going exactly the opposite of what the book says. The book says you press the seam towards the triangle, which creates a little fold over right here. I am pressing away from the triangle. I'll tell you why I believe that she's had you press them this way, because this is a dark fabric and this is a light fabric. So if you have any edge right here that looks dark, you could see it through the background, but it lays nicer if you put that triangle part up underneath this. So I am not worried about that. I am going to press them in the opposite direction, but Shelley says to press towards the triangle. You do whichever you like. I'm going in this direction, and then we're going to add that part. As a general rule, I try to press away from the triangles whenever possible. That's not always the case when you're putting blocks together and you have to meet seams and they're supposed to nest. But in this case, these seams don't nest. so I'm not as worried about it. So I made a judgment call on that one. Okay, so now we're stitching like that. It's going to create our little points on the outside of our block. That's our next step, so that's what I'm going to do. All right, and then the last part in this is to press, and Shelley says to press this down. So that's what we're going to do, and then our corner squares are all going to be done. So that is the end of step 3. Our finished parts are done. I'm just going to lay them back here on the back of the sewing machine bed, and we're going to move on to step 4. Now in your book, step 4 is our green fabric. It's our fabric number 3, actually. So I'm going to use fabric number 3 to make my parts. And it starts with my rectangles of my fabric 3. These are my red rectangles right here. And then I'm going to use those background squares again. I'm going to use 4. You're going to use 8. And we're going to stitch all of these guys in one single direction, which is exactly the same direction that we just stitched our rectangles of our navy. So one rectangle and my background square. And we're going to go from the upper point down to this bottom corner right here, just like that. And I'm going to stitch these down. Oh, let me know in the comments, because we have a brand new angle of the camera. If you need the camera to be up a little higher so you can see around my hands, we may have to do that. So we're checking to make sure all of our angles are correct, and they are. So this is another situation where we're going to press where we did our stitch. Now we're going to do our flip. We're going to press them, and then we're going to cut out that back. All right, there we go. We're done with step number 4. And step number 5, we're going to utilize our color 2 rectangles and the last of our squares, our background squares. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to stitch that rectangle or that square to the same side of our rectangle, but we're going in a different direction this time. So you have to make sure that you're going in the right direction. This time we're going from that center of the block corner all the way down to the lower corner. So we're going to start here and stitch down like that. All right, now we need to test our lines. So they're going, this one's going correct, that one, and that one. So we're good to go. So now we're going to flip this guy up, press, and cut out the back. All right, and now we're done with step 5. So we have all of our parts here to get ready for step number 6. So step number 6 is where we assemble these corners. So I'm going to take the corner block here that I had. We're going to have our colored, the first units that we did from step 4 are going to go onto this side, creating that part of the block. Our units we just made are going to go there. And then we have our squares that we have from our fabric number 5 or fabric number 4, which are going to go right here in the corner. So that's how we're going to assemble. So we're going to need to create this square. So I'm going to probably do this like so. We're going to attach these guys, all 4 of those, or in your case 8, and then we'll do the bottom part and then we'll put them together. So I'm just going to go ahead and put these together and start stitching. All right, the first part of our block is done, and I know I'm going to need to nest these seams, and according to the book arrows, I want to open it up and press the seam underneath my red section. So I'm going to go ahead and do that before I start these. So now I'm going to attach all of these guys, and then we'll press those in the opposite direction toward the blue and add them all together. So remember, these guys are going to press under that way, and then we'll be able to nest them. Last part of step 6 is to add that together like so. So I'm going to turn these up, nest the seam right here where it needs to meet, and I'm going to put a pin in there because anytime I really need something to meet, I like to use my pins. Okay. They match on the edges, and we're just going to sew right up. There we go. Looks pretty good. I'm going to press these down. All right, so those are those sections. So let's go ahead and start that center part that puts it all together. So step number 7, we're going to take these rectangles right here, which is our fabric number 4. And what I'm going to do is divide my strips because step 7 uses half of them and step 8 uses the other half. So I'm just going to take my half of my blocks. I have 8 here. You'll have 16. So you'll take 8, and I'm going to go ahead and set the others aside because I don't want to get these confused. And then the first step 7 requires that I take my fabric number 3, which in my case is this red color. I'm going to use squares, and then I'm also going to use these little squares. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to take our rectangle. We're going to put our red square on the left-hand side, pretty consistent, and then I'm going to stitch from this upper corner down to this lower side. Okay, so we'll do that first. All right, I have all of my squares, my rectangles and squares sewn, and they're all in the right direction. So now what I'm going to do is take them before I do anything else, and I'm going to add this blue square in the upper corner of the opposite side, and I'm going to sew in the same direction as this seam from corner to corner. So it's going to create that angled mark. All right, after I verify all my seam lines are going in the right direction, then it's time to press them out and trim out the excess. All right, congratulations, step 7 is done. Now we're moving on to step 8, which uses the last of our flowered rectangles, the last of our little blue squares, and our fabric number 2 squares. And we're going to assemble these much the same way we did the other block, except we're going to be diagonal in the opposite direction. So I'm going to put this square down here on the left-hand side again, but this time I'm going to sew from the center point top down to the bottom. So my angle is going to go like so. All right, I verified all my stitches are going in the correct direction. So now we time to add our little blue squares. So our little blue squares this time, instead of the upper corner, are going to go in the lower opposite corner, and your stitching line is going to be the same. So we went from here to here, we're going from here to here, same stitching line, same angle. All right, verifying that all of your squares and your seams are going in the proper direction as per instruction. Now it's time to press and trim out the back. All right, we've got step 8 complete, and now it's time to do step 9. Step 9 involves these 2 units right here. So we're going to go ahead and put those together. And what step 9 is going to be is a step 7 unit and a step 8 unit going together like this. And then we're going to put a background rectangle right on the top, like so. Okay, so to reference, your center of your block needs to have these 2 blue triangles making a bigger blue triangle, right? So whatever your color is on the left or right doesn't really matter. You're going to make this arrow and another little arrow. So that's what we're looking for. So we're going to put these 2 pieces together. We're going to press the seam between them open, and then we're going to add the top. So once this comes out like so, like that, we're going to go into the back and we're going to press the seam open. All right, there we go. The seam is open, okay? We're going to split the seam and open it up so that we reduce all that bulk, and then we add this background to the top. So we're just going to sew that right across the top, and that will finish that unit. So you're going to repeat that 8 times, and then we're going to be ready to assemble. All right, gang, and our step number 10, super easy. So we're going to put our block assembly together. So the start is row number 1. I'm going to move those a minute. Row number 1 has a corner, and our little center unit here. There it is, right there. That's row number 1. It's also row number 3. So we're going to go ahead and stitch these guys together, and nothing really needs to be pinned or met. So we're just going to stitch it, making sure that our seams are down in the direction they're supposed to be in, but otherwise just stitching it. And if you want, you can do that to both rows right now. So you can go ahead and sew 2 corners and 2 middles because you have at least 2 rows. And in your case, you're doing 2 blocks, so you can go ahead and do 4 of them if you want, just to get the chain piecing going. All right, and then I'm going to add my other corner here to one side. Again, lining everything up, corner to corner. Everything else is going to go just fine. And making sure that my seams are still going in the correct direction. All right, our top and bottom rows look like that. Setting those aside, let's work on our middle row. So our middle row is going to have our center section that we built going to the side, this one going to this side, and we're going to have that dark block right in the middle, and that's going to be what our center row looks like. So let's get that sewn. So this is a really good place to check that, you know, I've got this pieced portion here and this square is cut to size. So if it's not meeting at the points, you know, that's where you know you have 1/4 inch seam issues. I do not, so I'm just going to continue to stitch it. But that's a really good spot where you'll notice immediately if you have 1/4 seam issues. So now these seams are going to be pressed in underneath the blue. All right, this is our center row. So I'm going to take our top row, lay our center row on top of it, and then I'm going to nest those center seams. Just that area right there. I don't think anything else on this block meets where it needs to be pinned, but that center right there where that blue square is, definitely we want to pin there so we don't have any shifting under the sewing machine needle. And then you can just check and make sure everything matches at the corners. This one does. So we're going to align it and stitch it. And then our seam should be pressed up, and then we can attach the bottom. Bottom row, and turn it upside down so that it matches, and flip it over to, okay, and then we'll go ahead and pin right here again at the corners of that blue center square where our seams are going to nest because we pressed them correctly. And again, I'll reference that if you don't know which direction to press your seams, Shelley has the arrows right in the book so you can follow the arrows. Congratulations, guys, you've done another orchid block. How cool is that? Turned out beautifully. So we're going to pin this up to the board, and then we're going to head over back to the sewing machine and start block number 8, which is our Snapdragon block. All right, gang, I have my board for block number 8, and I want to show you in block number 8 a little close-up of the book here and show you where that pattern correction is. So I don't normally show the book on camera, but we're going to do that today so you can see exactly what we're looking at. So this is a folded up piece of the correction page, and this is the book page. So let's take a look at them closely. So when we're looking at the book, this is the original area of the book. My printer didn't print the colors correctly, so I went back in and drew them out. So in step 3, you'll see that we have white and pink, and pink is on the right, all the way along that step, right? And so it matches that number 3 right there. But if we look at number 4, you'll notice that 1, 2, 3 of these blocks show the red or the pink on the left-hand side, except for this one, okay? That's where the correction is. So I guess somebody drug that down and didn't replace the 2 strips in the back. So the correction page shows that the pink strips on step 4, the pink strips are on the left-hand side. So I just put a little note here that says correction. You want to flip those. And that's just a note, as we've done with all these other blocks, we go in at an angle and then we go in at a different angle and we're flip-flopping to make the stripes work. And so this just is a weird sketch correction that we need to do. So if you're looking at that and you go, oh yeah, I'm going to put all my my pinks on the right on this, and then you get to step 2, you're like, uh-oh, something's happened that's wrong. So that's the book correction right there. That's the only correction in this book. All the other parts are correct, and there is no measurement error. It's just that drawing right there. So we're correcting that drawing, and I'm going to walk you through it anyway, so you won't need it, but that is where that page comes in. So you can either mark it in your book, or you can take this and put it in there. You can tape that into the book. It's up to you, however you want to do it. Okay, so for step number 1 of the Snapdragons, we're going to use our eye piece, which is going to be our part at the top. And I'm just going to make sure that my measurements are correct here. Those are our big rectangle, or wide rectangles. So those are going to be on the top. And then we have another rectangle, K, which is right here. And that's going to be like that on the block. And then we have our squares of A. So those are going to be our first fabric. And that on me is this right here. So those are the parts we're going to do for the corners. And that's all we need at the moment. So obviously we're going to have to stitch these guys together first, so that we can attach that rectangle to the top. So step 1 is to attach your blue square to your cream colored small rectangle and press. All right, as the arrows indicated, I press towards the square, which in this case is the dark. And then I'm going to go ahead and add that rectangle across the top. So here's another one of those opportunities to check your 1/4 inch seam, because if this rectangle doesn't fit across the top, something's gone wrong. And the arrows say to press up. So we're going to do that. All right, there's our step 1 units done. We're going to put those back here. And then we have our step 2 units, and those are going to be our F and our I units like that. And we can go ahead and stitch every single one of these together. So we'll make 16 units of these, and that's fine. All right, and then we're going to press these to the dark, away from the background fabric. All right, there is step 2 done for now. So we'll set those aside. All right, step 3, we're going to use our A squares. All right, so we have, you will have 16 of these guys, the units for step 2, and you're going to need half of them. And the other half of the units you're going to put off to the side. And then you're going to need, of your A squares, you're going to need half of those. And you're going to put the other half off to the side. All right, so for step 3, we're going to take our A unit, our A square, and our unit from number 2. We're going to lay our blue square down on the bottom of this unit, making sure that our red stripe is on the right. We're going to have our red stripes on the right hand side. We're going to put our blue square at the bottom of this unit, and then we're going to stitch from the right side to the left side point, just like that. All right, so once that's done, we're going to make sure that our diagonal seams are going correct, and then we're going to take these over and press them and cut out the back. And guess what? I went and checked my book before I cut out the back, and I put all of these diagonal seams in the wrong direction. So I am going to fix all of these, and then we're going to come back and restitch. So want to make sure that you know that I sewed them incorrectly. All right, I have taken out all the squares, and then I re-sewed all the squares. It's going to look a whole lot better now, because now in step 3, I have my red to the right, and I have my line going from this side to this side. So we have corrected that, and I made sure they're all correct. And then when I open them up, they're now matching the photo and the picture that we have. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to go ahead and press them out so I can get the other square on. All right, so now they're all pressed and trimmed. I'm going to take my other little cream colored squares and I'm going to put, making sure that I know which side has the stuff on it. These tone-on-tones are crazy. I'm going to put a square in the upper corner opposite my blue, and I'm going to stitch it in the same angle. So from this corner to this corner, okay? All right, now that I have that done and I'm sure that they're going in the right direction, they look like the picture, I'm going to go ahead and press and trim. All right, there's our step 3s done, and as you may have guessed, step 4 is the opposite. So we're going to put those there. So remember in step 4, that's our correction. So the first photo shows the red lines going to the right, but they actually need to be on the left. So we're going to start with all of our red lines on the left. And then I'm going to lay my square down and I'm going to go from this corner to this corner just like it shows in the book. Okay, I think that's what I did when I made the mistake earlier. I looked at the wrong diagram. All right, now that I've sewn all my squares, right side to lower left corner, I'm going to go ahead and check and make sure it's right and then press and cut out the back. All right, and then on this one, we're going to take our parts and our little squares labeled L, and we're going to put those in the opposite corner of the blue, down on the red, and we're going to stitch in the same direction as the blue square because we're making that diagonal, right? So we're going from here to here, okay? Double check, make sure your parts are going in the correct direction and that your part's supposed to look like that. It does, so go ahead and press it, trim out the back. All right, so now we have all the parts together to go ahead and do our corner squares, and that is exactly what step number 5 is. So step number 5 takes the corner parts from step 1. We're going to use the step 3 units, which are these guys right here, and they are going to go like so. Our step 4 units are going to go like this, okay, which creates that corner bud. And then we're going to have our squares of H. H units are going to be these guys right here. So I'm only going to need, I think, half of these because the other half's going into another part. So there's our pieces. So we're going to sew rows like a tiny quilt and then add them together. That's our step 5. So let's do that. So I'm putting these two together, stitching them. I'll probably do all of these and then do all of the rest. All right, so for the top part of this unit, we're actually going to press towards the outside and then we'll come back and do the bottom. All right, there's that half of the block, and then we're going to have this part on here. We'll stitch all of these. All right, and then this block is going to get pressed, seams pressed that way. All right, now that we have the 2 sections, we put this part on the bottom. We're going to go ahead and nest the seams like so. I'm going to put a little pin here where the seams will nest and then stitch it. And that finishes those corner squares. All right, there's those corners. They're very long, so we're going to have quite a long little center section right here. And I'm going to set these off to the side so that we can start working on our step number 6. Our step number 6 starts with B squares, and that is going to be these guys right here. This is a B. Oh, wait a minute. I'm incorrect. This is not. Okay. They're not squares. They're rectangles. So if you look in the instructions on step number 6, it says, see, stitch and flip square in a rectangle on page 12. And so basically, we have a rectangle here. This seemingly square is not square because it's a ½ inch longer than it is wider. So when we're doing stitch and flip rectangles in this book, instead of turning the width this way and the height being shorter, we're turning it so that the height is taller than the width, okay? So this is an upright rectangle, and I'm going to show you the difference, okay? If we turn it this way, it's wider than it is taller. This way, it's taller, okay? So we're going to work with these rectangles in the tall format, and you can see that illustrated on page 12. So for the purpose of this, we're going to use these rectangles, and we're going to need our L squares, our background squares, which are these guys right here. And we're going to need our G squares, which are out of fabric number 4, which are these guys right. G squares are going to be these guys right here. This is our first block where the cutting instructions are actually in the 3/4 and 1/4 realm. Usually we're only in halves and whole sizes. So this is the first block where we start getting a little off the half and whole sizes. So we're going to take our bigger squares, and the bigger squares are going to go, our background ones are going to go to the top. So on this unit, they're going to go like this. And you can see that this is, you can really see now that this is not a square, it's a rectangle. And then your smaller square is going to go in the opposite corner. So your small squares are going to be at the bottom, and your big squares are going to be at the top. And we're basically just going to create that quarter look. So we're going to sew corner to corner and corner to corner, and then flip it out and do the opposite corner, same colors. So we're doing it sort of square and a square, but this is a square and a rectangle, okay? It's really technically a rectangle and a rectangle, but whatever. All right, so we're going to do all of these opposites. And you know I like to chain piece, so I'm just going to set my red squares down for a second, and we're going to chain piece, and I'm going to do all of the white squares in the upper. I'm doing the upper right corner, but you can do the upper left corner. That the corner doesn't matter because you're going to do the other corner in the next go round. You do want to make sure, however, that you're putting it at the top of the rectangle and that the rectangle is tall versus wide, okay? All right, I've done the first side, or the first corner. I'm going to cut these apart, and then I'm going to go to the opposite corner with the red, and we're not going to stitch over it. If we were going to stitch over it, I'd have you cut, but we're going to do the same diagonal just with the red squares. All right, there we go. I have opposite corners done, and if you did the other corners, it's no big deal. So we're going to press these out and trim behind, and then we're going to do the opposite corners. All right, now that we have these trimmed, we're going to do exactly the opposite by putting all the white squares in the opposite corner here. So in the opposite direction, and you'll do the same thing with the red. All right, once I've done the upper white, I'm going to do the lower red. All right, now we've checked and we're going in the right direction. So we're just going to press and trim, and you can see how we have our squares have crossed each other in a very, very tall. This block is meant to be much taller. So we have this huge crossover here that's way more than 1/4 inch. And that's what we're supposed to have. All right. So this is what our units are supposed to look like. There they are. And then our second unit starts with an H square, which are going to be these guys right here. Those are going to be the center of my blocks. Those are H. And then we're going to have G, which are going to be these guys. Again, the little red ones. And we're going to have E squares. And my E squares are these guys right here. Obviously, they're going to go into opposite corners. So I'm going to do the dark red squares in one set of corners and the lighter red squares in another set of corners. So, okay. All right, we have all of those in. So, and it doesn't really matter which way we stitched them. We just want to make sure that the opposite color is in the opposite corner. All right, now that these are done, we're going to press them out, cut behind, and then we'll do the opposite corners. So as an example, there we are. We have our light red at the bottom and our dark red at the top. So we're going to do the opposite and put another red here, going corner to corner, and then we'll come back and put the red here, and then those units will be done. All right, we're just going to open these up and trim out the back, and we'll be done. All right, now we have our points done, and that's how they go, just like so. So the top, and the last little part that we have in step number 8 is to attach this to this, and then another one of these at the bottom, and that finishes the block out just like that, okay? So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to take piece 1 from step 6, attach it red triangles to red triangles to step 7, and then step 8 is to attach that rectangle at the bottom. All right, because there's so many triangles on these, you're going to open up the seams between the two squares. So we're going to press these with the seam open. So I'm going to press all of these seams open, and then I'm going to attach those guys. All right, those are all pressed open, and then we're going to attach this little guy to the bottom. So let's do that really fast. Alrighty. So here are our center strips, and then remember we have our corners that we made earlier, and then we have one piece left, which is our center square. So I'm going to set my center square down below here, along with 2 of these centers. And then let's make the top row and the bottom row. So the top row is a corner and a corner with a center in it, just like so. So we're going to attach those. I'm going to line these guys up. And there is really no place where everything needs to be pinned or anything like that. We're just going to stitch it. I'm going to line my corner. Oops. Start aligned with my corner. Make sure everything is matching up. And that all of the seams, the pressed seams, are going in the direction we pressed it. Look, there's one that tried to get away from me. So I'm going to use my little tool here to lay that back down. And it just makes the back look neater and not have any bulk or something like that when you make sure. There we go. And then we'll do the same thing on the other side. Lining up point to point. Or corner to corner. And then I'm just making sure that everything's fitting right and that my seams are going in the right direction. Nothing's getting shifted on me. Okay, pressing out. And then we have that center. So here are our center pieces. We're going to put that light red to the center, the blue squares out, and put that center square in. That's going to be the center of our block. And we're going to press those seams in towards the center square. All right. So to finish, we're going to take our center and attach it to our top row, that little spot right there in the center is the place where we're going to nest, right there at that center square. So that's where we're going to put our little pins. And that also helps to keep everything from shifting from one end to the other if we stop at the pins. It makes sure every little bit of ease happens so we can get our corners matching on both sides. So we'll pin right there in the center. Start at the top. Again, you're just making sure that your seams don't get caught and that you're stitching it, you know, make sure everything's aligned and these little folds right here go under properly at the 1/4 inch. Looks good. So we're going to press out. Her arrows say to press out. You could press out or in, but I probably follow the arrows. It's looking great. And now the last part is to take that same top, flip it to the bottom so that it matches the way it's supposed to, and attach it. This is our bottom row of our block. And I'm going to nest it right here by that center square. Again, we're going to nest it so that matches, those little edges match there, but also because that makes sure that the center is aligned with the center. And if we have any easing, we can ease it out to the outside. Okay? All right. Last seam. Here we go, everybody. I have gotten, there it is, the Snapdragon block, looking just like the one up on the wall. Let's put it up on the wall real quick. All right, so we're done with our flower farm for July, blocks number 7 and number 8. So, you know, you're more than halfway done, I think. I think you're at least halfway done, if not more than halfway done with this quilt, because we did some extra blocks at the end. So that leaves us with, oh gosh, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, I think. So we have like, 9, 10, 11, 12, is that like 8 blocks left, I think? We have 8 blocks left. And we're making all kinds of cool progress. So you are all finished with block 7 and block 8. Next month, we're going to do blocks 9 and 10. Interesting thing about next month, block number 9 is our last 16-inch block that we're going to do in this group. So these were 16 inches. Block number 9 is 16 inches. And then when we get to block 10, it's going to go down significantly to 8. So still going to be pretty, still going to have a lot of parts, but it's going to shrink down a little bit. And I believe when we do, if I'm not mistaken, when we do block 8, we're going to make 3 at a time. So our 16-inch blocks, we usually only make 2. Once we get down into the smaller blocks, we're going to make more blocks because they're smaller. So I think I say this every single month, but now's a great time to get caught up. If you go to Cabin Quilters on YouTube, hit that playlist button, because the playlist button gives you all types of categories, like a filing cabinet of different videos that I provided on the site. And there is a flower farm playlist or a flower farm filing cabinet where we put all of these videos. So if flower farm's the only thing you want to watch, you can go right to that playlist and go straight there. And if you're a newer quilter and you haven't quilted in a long time, or say you're a sewist that is very accomplished, but you're just picking up the sewing machine again and starting to quilt, I have an entire Beginner 101, Quilt 101 playlist that is also available in that little playlist filing cabinet type area that you can click on, and you can watch those videos at your leisure and maybe learn some tips or tricks or refresh some of your skills. Okay, so those are available at all the time. So I really hope you enjoyed this month's Flower Farm video. I'm hoping that you're going to enjoy all the upcoming content that we have. Don't forget, we have an online site where we sell books, patterns, templates, all of that. You can find that at cabinquilters.com. Also on the website is the entire Lake and Leisure Retreat page. Here we are right inside of the Lake and Leisure Retreat, and we have plenty of dates. I know I have some spaces in the fall this year, upcoming in September and October, and we also have plenty of dates for next year for quilt therapy retreats, which I'm really excited about. Also in January of 2027, we have the Panama and others cruise. So the whole cruise at the Caribbean is available. Please check out our Panama cruise. It's going to a lot of different places. There are 5 days at sea. There's a beautiful quilt that we're going to make. I provide the entire quilt kit. If you click through the information page, go to Michelle, go to where she is hosting and doing all of the paperwork with Holland America Cruise Lines. She will provide you all the information you need. We're coming up to the point where there isn't going to be a payment plan anymore, so I want you to go ahead and get your spot. You have to go through Michelle if you want to be a part of the quilting part of the cruise, which is 5 days at sea. You get the quilt kit. Also, Michelle arranges it so all of your port fees, your taxes and gratuities are included. This is an all-inclusive cruise, so it's going to be a really fun, easy way for you to join us in the Caribbean in January because it's so cold everywhere. We're just going to take a break and go someplace warm. So, and then the last thing I want to remind you of is I collaborate with my great friend Terri with Moose and Squirrel Quilters. If you like wonderful quilting conversations between very experienced quilters and designers, you can check out our podcast on YouTube at Moose and Squirrel Quilters on YouTube. I'm going to link all of this in the description box, and we're going to do an affiliate page as well on the website. But if you are interested in any of the products you see in any of the videos, we have put them all on the Amazon storefront. So the link to that is below. Anytime you're interested in a product that you see online and you purchase it through our link on Amazon, it helps support the channel. So we really appreciate that because supporting the channel means we can bring you more and more content for free. So thank you so much for joining us today. I will see you next week with brand new content I'm super excited about. And until next time, I hope you catch up on your flower farm. Happy quilting.